Welcome back, everybody, to Tidal Flooding Talk, brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition in conjunction with our broadcast partners at Triax 57. I'm Joe Martucci. The whole gang is back again. We have Palma Shiles, Dan Skeldon here. Palma, we missed you the past couple of episodes.
I was sad not to make it, but I think anybody that has had any work on their teeth can attest to it is very painful, and I don't think I would have been a very pleasant person to have on the last episodes after my root canal. So, but I'm back.
Yes, no, you're back. Teeth are good. Teeth are feeling good.
Yeah.
All right, good. As somebody who has 4 fake teeth in the front right here, I've seen a lot of teeth things in my life, and it can be very painful for a long period of time. Dan, hopefully all your teeth are good. You got your teeth. You got a nice full set of teeth.
We're good. It's nice to have Palma back, and you were definitely missed. You missed some meteorology talk, when it's all meteorologists, but great to have the gang all back together. Got some great guests lined up for tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's get into it. We have 2 journalists from the Washington Post here. We have Ben Knoll and Sarah Kaplan. They're here today to talk about a really insightful piece that they did called "A New Era of Floods Has Arrived. America Isn't Prepared." A lot of this centered on the flooding with Helene, as well as what happened in Texas. So Ben and Sarah, welcome to Tidal Flooding Talk.
Great to be here. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, great. And Ben, we should say you're really live in New Zealand still most of the time, but you're in DC. You didn't fly to DC just for us, did you?
No, that would be nice, but no, I do a little trip to see the team here on a hopefully a yearly basis. But yeah, most of my forecasting happens in the U.S. from about 8,500 miles away in New Zealand, which really goes to show you can do meteorology from just about anywhere we these days.
You make me think of something I usually say, which is I think if you asked meteorologists, do you like technology? I think everybody would say yes, because we love whatever's latest and greatest. All right, so let's get into the story here. One of the key points, or at least the key messagings both of you had in this story was a quote, "new era of floods." Now, in the context of this article, what kind of flooding are we talking about? Are we talking about rainfall flooding? Are we talking about tidal flooding? What does this encapture?
Yeah, so the story really focuses on rainfall flooding. We saw with Hurricane Helene, which hit a bunch of the southeast states last year, but most heavily in North Carolina, that typically when we think about hurricanes, you think about things like storm surge and coastal flooding. You think that the coast is going to be the most heavily impacted, but actually NOAA data show, and we saw with Helene, that the biggest hazard from hurricanes is rain, and that rainfall-induced flooding can be incredibly catastrophic. And so one of the things we wanted to look at with this story was, how can we account for the really intense rainfall, which broke records during Helene, and also why was Western North Carolina, a very inland county, so devastated and not really prepared for that amount of water falling in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, guys, I know the forecast for Helene, I remember this transpiring, all the media attention and all the spotlight was down on the landfall point. And, that's what the media just does. Where is the hurricane going to make landfall? And
totally.
It's just kind of falsely assumed that that's going to be the hardest hit area. But, the forecasts for what happened in North Carolina were good, but the messages weren't conveyed. Any idea, on why that is and how we can go about changing that in this new era of floods?
That's exactly what the story sought to explore. So I covered Helene. I was down in North Carolina shortly after the storm hit, spent weeks reporting down there about all of the fallout. And the thing I heard again and again from residents was that we weren't warned about this. We didn't think that something like this could happen. But exactly like you said, when I went back and I looked at, what were the forecasts, what was the messaging from the Weather Service, it was spot on. I mean, the same day that the first storm surge warning was issued by the Weather Service, there was also a flash flood warning for Western North Carolina. The messaging, you know, even on like the storm made landfall at 11 p.m. on Thursday, and the worst impacts started to be felt on a Friday morning. But days before that, the Weather Service was saying, you know, don't be distracted by the landfall point. Like the flash flooding is the thing that we're really concerned about. But exactly like you said, that message was not getting through to residents. And so I wanted to understand, you know, where was the disconnect? Where is it like that we need to be working on that communication aspect? So one of the things that I looked at was comparing how did public officials in Florida message the hurricane to their residents compared with officials in North Carolina. And what we found was that in Florida, there was very strong messaging. The rhetoric was very intense. And so they issued mandatory evacuation orders many days in advance of landfall. And you had, you know, sheriffs and county officials saying things like, write your name and your social security number on your arm with Sharpie so that if your body has to be identified, that they'll be able to do it. Like very, very intense rhetoric, which was commensurate with, you know, that this was a Category 4 hurricane, that the storm surge was gonna be, you know, more than a dozen feet in some of these coastal counties. But then when you go up to Western North Carolina, which is this mountainous inland area, the messaging was not as strong. So officials would say things like, if you live near the river, you should consider evacuating. If you live in a place that floods, you should consider evacuating. But residents told me they didn't really know how to interpret that. They would compare what they were, you know, when they heard, okay, there's a hurricane coming, they would think about, well, what are the hurricanes that I've experienced in the past? And they would sort of make their decisions based off of their own past experience, not realizing how much worse this was going to be, right? That the past is not, and this is a climate change issue, right? The past is not a predictor of the future or even of the present. And so that's really, I think, one of the things that communities are going to have to work on, particularly these inland communities that don't really have a lot of infrastructure around hurricanes and flooding, is just helping people to understand how do you prepare for the unimaginable, something that hasn't happened before, but is going to increasingly happen because we live in this warmer climate.
Now, do you think that public officials kind of are more, you know, conservative with what message they deliver because they might be fearful that, hey, the hurricane's gonna switch paths? I mean, I'm sure Joe and Dan can both attest to, we've seen that happen where we see something, you know, it's going to hit landfall here and then it takes a turn and everybody evacuated for nothing. So do you think that maybe some public officials, specifically North Carolina, do you think they were worried if I do say, you know, write your social security number on your arm and then it doesn't hit us, people are gonna lose their mind over that?
Yeah, I mean, I
not
definitely
be prepared the next time, you know?
Totally. There's like such a concern about sort of false alarms. And as you just said, if you issue an evacuation order and then the storm doesn't turn out to be as bad, the next time you don't want a boy who cried wolf situation, right? You don't want the next time people to not heed an evacuation order because they think it's, you know, hyperbolic. So that was definitely one element that the officials in Western North Carolina I spoke with, that's one thing they were considering. Another thing that we found in our reporting is that, you know, in order to issue an evacuation order, there's a whole infrastructure and like education that you need to have for your community members, right? You need to have an evacuation plan. You need to have designated routes. People need to know where they're supposed to go. And that just doesn't exist in Western North Carolina. The vast majority of counties that were affected by Helene didn't have flood evacuation plans. And so even if officials had wanted to issue an evacuation order, a mandatory evacuation order, they didn't, like, it would have been really hard to safely get people away from the rivers There's also that issue of the topography and the terrain. It's, the mountainous areas, it's not as obvious where to go. Like on the coast, you just know you go away from the ocean. But in a mountainous area like this, where the flooding is coming not just from the major rivers, but also these like little creeks and waterways that are sometimes on very remote, people live in remote areas along winding roads. The evacuation can be dangerous. And that was another concern that officials had. So it's not, I think that one of the things that we really wanted to communicate with this was it's not that anyone's fault, right? There was no one mistake that was made that led to the loss of life of more than 100 people that we saw in Western North Carolina, but it was just sort of a systemic, there has not been as much emphasis in the emergency management community or in just sort of the among officials in general in the US on dealing with inland flooding that happens from extreme rainfall. And as Ben's data shows, and Pete should probably talk about that extreme rainfall and the inland flooding that results is going to be getting only worse as the climate warms.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to take a brief break here. We'll come back on the other side. You're listening to Tidal Flooding Talk. Thanks to the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, your flood insurance bills are lower and your streets safer from the reality of flooding. Since beginning in 2013, we build more resilient shoreline communities. Our member towns develop and share in best practices that anticipate future concerns and create flooding solutions. From our town-specific free web app for flooding information to our weekly Tidal Flooding Talk show, we focus on flooding 24/7. Visit www.njcoastalcoalition.com for more.
Hello and welcome back. You're watching Tidal Flooding Talk. We are brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, who would like to remind our viewers that floodwaters are not just an inconvenience. They can cause fires, contamination, and serious structural damage. If severe flooding is expected and officials recommend evacuation, don't wait, just go. Have an emergency plan in place, prepare for the worst, and prioritize safety above all else.
All right, so we are back with Ben and Sarah here at the Washington Post. Ben, this is part of a series that you and the team are doing called Flood Above. Can you just tell us about what that is and, where else are you looking to report on as we go forward into the year?
Yeah, so Floods Above is kind of this exploratory series of stories about how rainfall is affecting different parts of the world more significantly in different ways. And Helene is kind of one way that shows how people, inland flooding in this case, are unprepared for that hazard. So it's kind of exploring the fuel for rainfall. So in this case, we're looking at water vapor and the amount of water vapor that is pulsing through the skies. Meteorologists, we look at this variable, as I'm sure Joe is familiar with and Dan's familiar with, is precipitable water. So how much water is in the column of the atmosphere from the surface all the way up to the top. And if we wring it out, that is essentially a proxy for how much rain can possibly fall out of the sky, right? So in 2024, which was, of course, a very warm year, a record year for global temperatures, it was also a record year for atmospheric moisture. So what we saw were some of these individual weather events were kind of contributing to this long-term trend that we're seeing with record atmospheric moisture. There was Helene last year. That broke moisture records from Florida right up into the southern Appalachians. In fact, carried about 1.5 times as much moisture as the previous system that tracked through that region. So it kind of shows us that, storms like Helene that occur, in the year 2024, if you had a storm like that happened, maybe 4, 5, 6 decades earlier, it may not have had that much juice or as much juice to work with as kind of one that's, forming in the modern day climate. And there were a number of other systems last year that also kind of broke moisture records near the United States. Milton as well. There were some records. That system, of course, made landfall in the Gulf Coast, Western Florida, and a few other ones that harnessed record warm ocean temperatures, the evaporation from the Gulf, from the Western Atlantic, that kind of formed the issues that Sarah was discussing around the risk for inland flooding. Because what happens is that moisture slams up against the Appalachian Mountains there. It's forced to rise. That air cools, condenses, it rains out. And when you have a record amount of moisture hitting the mountains, hundreds of miles inland, big problems when that water flows down through the waterways into villages and towns. So it's not just an issue here that I think the United States is going to be facing. This is kind of a global issue. And I think with this series, which will be coming out over the coming months, we'll look at some of these places maybe around the world, that are quite susceptible, like Western North Carolina, other places that carry that kind of increasing risk. Rainfall is not something that is uniform around the planet. It's a difficult thing to predict. Most meteorologists know it's a lot harder than temperature. But what we can do is use kind of this moisture as almost a way to kind of track where the risk for really heavy rain and flooding may be around the planet. So we're kind of trying to map that out a little bit and give people some extra new information about where that is changing and where these kind of flows of moisture are growing and rising most substantially.
Very interesting, guys, because with the tidal flooding talk here, obviously climate change, we talk a lot about sea level rise and more tidal flooding along the shore. But I think the lesser known, and sea level rise kind of gets a lot of talk and a lot of coverage in the media, but a warmer climate being a wetter climate, more water vapor, more moisture is something that I don't think people are aware of. What are the I guess ingredients? Is it tropical systems? Is it like mountainous terrain? Where else do you think, like Western North Carolina? Maybe you don't know the answer to this because you're just exploring this now, but kind of what are the perfect ingredients, the perfect storm ingredients that will lead to these flooding events? And are there any other examples in the U.S. or in the world that you've come across yet?
Yeah, so look, I think in talking to experts, what we've kind of heard is that really the warming oceans are kind of the biggest driver of this increase in atmospheric water vapor. But that's not the only piece. I mean, the warming oceans, the warmer atmosphere, as you said, has a higher moisture carrying capacity. But where we're seeing kind of changing wind flows, so what we call circulation, where you're getting more airflows coming up from a warm and moist place like the tropics, that in tandem with the other warming that's going on, when you kind of have a change in wind flow, can really exacerbate the issues that we saw with Helene. So if you look around the world, a couple of examples in the media over the last couple of months, you would have heard about Pakistan and the monsoonal flows that are occurring there, coming off the Indian Ocean into the Indian subcontinent. So that's an area. The Western Pacific Ocean, you're looking at China, places that face flooding over the most recent summer. Kind of the West Pacific is this probably the biggest heat engine on the planet in terms of ocean warmth. So places like the Philippines, places like Japan, Western Asia, and in the U.S. as well. I think places across the Northeast. And the mid-Atlantic, when you have these flows coming from the Gulf, coming from the Western Atlantic, they're a little bit more vigorous than they used to be. And we've seen that flooding events over the last summer hitting big cities, extreme rainfall intensities that frankly weren't reached as frequently in the past, are now seemingly being reached easier. And this kind of trend, I think, is what we're seeing is kind of aligned with that long-term warming and moistening. So it really touches places differently in a non-uniform way, but it does, I think, affect the entire planet.
We're going to take one more break and we'll come back on the other side here. You're listening to Tidal Flooding Talk.
Welcome back to this week's Tidal Flooding Talk. We continue our discussion with Ben Knowles, Sarah Kaplan from the Washington Post. Everything flooding on the menu this week, guys. And want to get back to a little bit about messaging. And that's something, broadcast meteorologists have to deal with all the time. The forecast can be great, but if people aren't getting the message, getting the point, getting the warnings, you know, the forecast can be good, but if it's falling upon deaf ears and people aren't acting, you know, it's worthless. And what's going to happen? And Helene is going to be repeated again. You know, what have you guys found as to, you know, how we can kind of fix that discrepancy, and how can we message better as the media?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it comes down to the kind of pre-education. So like well before a storm is in the forecast, like getting communities sort of more in the mindset of thinking about a flood could happen here. If you go to coastal communities in North Carolina, for example, areas in the east, a lot of them will have markers of like, here's what 9 feet of storm surge looks like. Right, most coastal states have know your zone campaigns to educate residents about, do you live in an evacuation zone? Where do you go? And that just doesn't exist. That infrastructure doesn't exist for the most part in inland areas. Even though, as we've seen, inland flooding can be as dangerous, if not more, than coastal flooding. And so I think, part of it comes down to that, like, you don't want the first time that someone thinks about, okay, what do I do in a flood, to be like as the water is rising at their door. I think also, one of the things that is really difficult that came up a lot in my conversations with residents was that they were hearing messages but not internalizing them, right? So they would get, one person told me that she saw the message from the weather service, the emergency alert that came on her phone, that said, flash flooding, if you stay inside unless you're under an evacuation order. But she didn't know what to do with that information. She lived in an apartment that was sort of on stilts overlooking the river. And so she was like, well, I'm up high, I'll be fine. Turned out her apartment, she was able to escape, but her apartment was swept away by the floodwaters. And if she had stayed, that it would have been really catastrophic. And so I think part of it also is like, just getting people in the habit of really paying attention to those messages when they get them, and making sure that they heed them, not just swipe away on their phone.
Now, after disasters, I think we can agree that people are more open to stronger, rules and better prep for a storm. But how long do you think that window lasts?
Yeah, I actually spoke with a researcher who studies exactly that, sort of how do you seize the moment after disaster. And she said that the window is shrinking, like compared to after Hurricane Katrina, which happened, exactly 20 years ago. That Katrina created this huge window for trying to address emergency management and preparedness, and like FEMA was like totally revolutionized because of it. But that she has found that the window of openness has been getting shorter and shorter. And then the other thing is just, it's not, you don't just want to, it's not enough for one community to change, right? For Western North Carolina to say, okay, we're gonna be prepared for flooding now. She spoke about like, it shouldn't take getting hit by a catastrophic and deadly flood for every community to understand that this could happen to them. I think that's one of the things about inland flooding that makes it such a important issue, is that it could happen anywhere, right? You can't say, oh, that's a problem for the coast, or oh, that's a problem for the mountains. Like, inland flooding can happen in any community, which means every community needs to be focused on it.
Well, Sarah, Ben, we really appreciate this conversation. It's important work that you did. And, the inland flooding part is something that, like Dan was saying, doesn't always get all the headlines like a storm surge, but is, as we saw in Helene, can be even more impactful than what happens with the storm surge. Before we start wrapping up, can you just tell us where we could follow more of your work?
Yeah, WashingtonPost.com/climate. Have I got that right, Sarah? I hope.
Yeah.
Awesome. So WashingtonPost.com/climate. We're not fully done yet. I did have to ask Ben one question because Ben, I've known you at least on the internet for a long time because you're internet famous for your weather school closing predictor formula. I don't know what you want to call it. How are we looking on that? And
Man,
what
yeah,
made
winter.
you want to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, who doesn't want a day off of school? I mean, I was, I was in elementary school, and actually, it was a blizzard in 1996. If you guys are familiar with that, I mean, that storm dropped feet of snow near New York City, probably about 2 feet of snow. That's where I grew up, and that's how I caught the weather bug. And ever since that storm in the late 1990s, I pretty much knew I wanted to be a meteorologist. And the combination of the snow thing and having a day off of school. I was younger. I was just kind of like, in maybe middle school, and everyone would ask me, "Oh, we have a snow day tomorrow." I became kind of the weather guy, and at that point, I'd look at the Weather Channel, I'd look at a couple different sources, and I'd come up with like a combined forecast. But one thing led to another, and now, now I'm doing those school closing and delay forecasts here, many decades on. And quite a following across the Hudson Valley of New York. So superintendents, teachers, students, parents kind of follow along for a little bit of fun. I like to think of it as a way to bring the community together. In a way that it can be a little bit fun, entertaining, but also serious in the fact that we're, trying to keep everybody safe here, keep everybody off the roads during snow and ice in the winter. And have developed that kind of trust factor with a lot of the folks in southern New York. So still going on to this day, and winter is right around the corner. So the first snow can't be that far off. A couple months now.
No, it can't. We're going to have a winter outlook episode in November. We're going to talk about what we can expect, mainly throughout the East Coast. All right, we got about 2 minutes left. We're going to end this as we do every week with the one thing we can't stop talking about: tidal flooding or otherwise. Dan, the floor is yours.
I can't stop talking about, and this is, I didn't think I'd bring it up necessarily tonight, but New Zealand. Ben, New Zealand is like the #1 place that me and my wife, if we had to ever move anywhere, we want to go to. I will say 2 questions. How long is the flight, and is it as beautiful as the research I've done shows?
Great questions. Yeah, it is beautiful. I can attest to that. But first, I'll start with that flight. That flight, if you've never, what I'll say is once you do that New Zealand flight, it'll make LA like a walk in the park, like, across country. So, they started a couple years ago a direct flight from JFK, New York, out to Auckland, which is about 18 hours, give or take.
Wow.
So, yeah, you're in that seat for a long time. But when you get there, what awaits you is just this beautiful country. I don't have enough good things to say about it. It's just so,
Okay.
it's a really beautiful place. The South Island is real special. Mountains to the beach in the same day, skiing and surfing. If you want to do that, that's your cup of tea. Great coffee, really friendly people. As a New Yorker, it's taught me how to be a little bit more relaxed. It's a place, it's a lot more, kind of chill. Look, anyone that's watching that has it on their list, I'd say, go for it if you can make it happen. Yeah.
I'm going to pass it on to my wife. Thank you.
Paula, go ahead.
I think so. What I would like to talk about is I think that from now on, whenever we have a meteorologist or just really anyone that has found their way into the field of weather in some capacity, I think we need to start betting on whether or not they realized they wanted to have a career in weather as a child. Because I think 9 times out of 10, every story we've heard of a meteorologist, they were 6, they were 10, when a storm hit and they decided, this is what I want to do.
That's true for you, right? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, for what it's worth, I experienced that same snowstorm in '96, and it did not turn me into a meteorologist. I came to my love of science and weather much later. So,
all right, so we're at
more
50
snow for you
tonight.
And Dan, I think yours was Gloria, right?
It was, 9 years old. So yeah, Palm, I think you're onto something there. Yep.
I have to say, I'm like half in with Palma here because I have wanted to be a meteorologist since a child, but I don't have like one event that like really like stuck out. I was 5 for the blizzard of '96 in New Jersey, and I don't really remember it. I just think it was always like watching the meteorologist on television and thinking like that was so cool. Anyway, I'm going to do my one thing I'm going to ask Ben a question here. This is a snow day question. So what, in your professional snow day opinion, what is better, the delayed opening or the early dismissal?
Ooh, that's a good one. Look, I'm a night owl, so I used to stay up playing video games in high school. So anytime we had that 2 hour delay, I was like, oh, this is excellent. The early dismissal, I mean, it's cool and all, but you actually got to go in, you got to get ready, and then you got to, ditch a little bit early. So, and then sometimes you get the 3 hour delays, and those are real special, reserved for some, circumstances that don't come around too often, but I like those two.
Okay. The master has spoken about that. There we go. All right. Well, great. Well, for Ben, for Sarah, for Palma, for Dan, I'm Joe Martucci. Thanks for watching this episode of Tidal Flooding Talk, everyone. We'll be back with you next Tuesday with a new episode.